Hello, welcome to the Curious Leaders Path. Um, we have Todd Cargus and Joanne Stone and myself, Katarina, Kat. Very lovely to see both of you again.
You too.
As always.
So we have a lovely topic, which is
Oh, here, I'll
when
put it back.
ideas and organizations die. Talking about death today.
Yeah.
There's lots
That's a
of
strange
reasons.
one.
It really is a strange one, isn't it? But it's so
Mhm.
essential. And as we've talked about in a few conversations now, it's a conversation that we really need to engage in a lot more. You know, as we live in this world of increasing uncertainty and where more innovation is required, where we need to change our lifestyles, where we need to change how businesses run, you know, it's a question of how far we have to go with all of these things. But the reality is, if we want to survive, sorry to laugh, if we want to survive climate change and not die as a species, we probably really need to start changing how we organize things. And so we were talking about death in a few contexts over the last few conversations that we've had privately as well as on our videos. And really what we need is we need deaths in order so that we can make way for renewal and transformation.
Mhm.
Yeah. So, and one of the things that we talked about, and this is obviously in the context of climate change and really just renewing how we do our business, is in the regenerative economy, in regenerative agriculture, in the circular economy, there's this idea that we have to design products not just for design and production and use and then disposal, but what we need to do is design them all the way from cradle to grave and then recycling them and reusing them and repurposing them. And the more that we can think about that, the more we can start designing death and obsolescence into everything that we do, including business design, in order for us to actually find ways to learn as much as we can, prepare ourselves for the deaths, prepare ourselves for the process of letting go and celebrating what we've learned and what we got, and then moving on to the renewal and transformation.
Mhm.
Joanne and Todd, why do you think this is such an important topic to talk about?
Mm. You want to go first, Joanne?
I it's, I'm still thinking about the personal conversation or the conversation we
Yeah.
had just recently about my mom and
Yeah.
just about bringing up and planning for death, right? Because ultimately, um, it's going to happen and all that kind of stuff. And it's like, it's, as my friend calls it, dying well, like preparing to
Mm-hmm.
die. So, getting everything kind of in order and making sure your wills are done, all the other stuff is done. And with my mom, we were talking about, my mom's already, going to get cremated. And then after the cremation, she wants to get buried in like some forest, and she wants us to bring Tim Hortons coffee. Although, as I was saying earlier, I think she'd like me to upgrade it to Starbucks. but but there's something about that with and exactly what you said, Kat, which is like this is all part of the normal, natural part of
Yeah.
life, right? And I don't see that type of like plan for dying well in organizations or planning or you know that aspect of people
Mhm.
shutting down lines of businesses,
Mm.
especially in the huge organizations. You don't see them shut down lines of businesses or products as much, right? So there's this essential pruning of a business
Yeah.
where I think is required in order for the main business to survive. You need to kind of like prune the roots, right? You need to prune
Mhm.
the stuff, right? And I just don't see that we do that enough, right? So and it to me, all the other things that happen because we don't do that, we end up having to retaining more people, more costs, right? And then we have to get into layoffs and all that kind of stuff. And I think that brings in more sadness, right? Than
Mhm.
if we actually kind of have planned all this in the first place. Anyways, I'll stop there. And Todd, what would you like to add?
Well, I think that what came up for me as you were talking was that with people, we know that dying is inevitable. Like we're all going to die. It's just part of the human experience. Um, but so often when we think about organizations or companies or products, death is equated with failure.
Mm.
Yeah.
And I right and I think
Yeah.
there's so so the longevity of something, like things will outlive their usefulness because it's considered a failure. And like, the things that popped into my head when I was going through this, I was trying to come up with some examples of things that, that that weren't considered failures, but I don't know that I can. Like, the one that immediately popped into my head is, well, we don't drive, horse and buggies anymore because we have cars with internal combustion engines, and maybe we just didn't consider that a failure. I don't consider it a failure because I don't know any 18th century buggy makers to talk to, but
If you go to
probably-
Amish country, I'm sure you can find them,
right.
But
Right.
but not in Toronto.
Right.
I think there's a lot of people right now that would call it failures because of the issues it's having with climate. So
Yeah.
just to kind of
course.
my climate side of me is going,
Well,
yeah,
and
without that thought in mind. But anyways,
and that's a really good example of, well, so what's the next step, right?
Yeah.
So if the auto industry is going to die, is it a failure because it died, or is it something else, or is it just the
Or
natural
another.
Or is it
progression?
the current iteration of
Yeah.
the automobile company that needs to die? Because we still need mobility, we still need transportation,
Right.
but maybe the way that we do it is what needs to die, and we need to find better ways of doing it.
Right.
Yeah.
So
Yeah,
the
no, I
EVs, if you think
agree.
about electric vehicles, as they rise in popularity, that's replacing the internal combustion engine. But maybe we even need to think about mobility in a very different way. Do we all need our own individual cars, or should we have more shared vehicles? Should we have more public transport? Should we have alternatives? And obviously, this is from an urban perspective. If you live in a rural environment, it's a totally different discussion, right? So maybe we even need to, in that vein of the automobile industry, maybe the question isn't, do automobile companies need to die, or do we need to change how we view mobility in urban settings?
Yeah, I
Exactly.
mean, and you can create something totally different from that, right? Because which makes sense, right? Or is there a component within, the automobile that needs to change so that doesn't doesn't burn the gas, and it does something differently, right?
Yeah.
I keep on thinking Back to the Future and let's start using all of
Garbage
the
automatic,
garbage and whatever, right?
Yeah.
So-
I'd love to direct our attention to the chat because Connie's put in a really interesting comment. Here, I'll put it on the screen, about Sears Canada. Right, when Sears Canada died, we considered a failure for retail, and that's really, really interesting because Sears certainly had competitors within the marketplace. So was it a failure because some of Sears's competitors are still operating, although I would argue that they're limping. But at the same time, Sears is a very, very old company, and other very, very old companies are operating in the same space. And what's the emotional attachment associated with something like that dying? Sears Canada went away, and many thousands of people across the country lost their jobs. So it's not just right. Like, it's not just the death of an organization because it's the right thing to do. It's also something that's so very completely wrapped up in my livelihood and who I am, especially if it's something that I've done for a long time. My working life will be, touch wood, 3-4 decades long, whatever. And some of the companies that I've worked for, I've worked for the Hudson Bay Company, and it was established, by King Charles II in 16 something. I've seen the Royal Charter, it's what? So organizations can have lifespans that are much, much longer than a human lifespan.
Yeah. Although it's pretty unusual. There was some research done on how long companies actually last, and there's the oldest company. Is it one of the oil and gas, one of the energy companies is 700 years, but that's 700 years old. But I don't remember which one it was. It's a name we all know. It's a big name. But the majority of companies generally last, I think it was under 100 years. And part of that has to do with not being able to renew themselves, like Hudson's Bay has. If you think about Eaton's died, Sears died. If you're from Western Canada, Woodward's died, and Woodward's was an institution. It was very similar to Eaton's. So there's been lots of retail stores that have died. And the question is, how much of that was because they couldn't renew, they were stuck in the past? You know, for example, Kodak would fit into that. Kodak
Yeah.
died because they were so stuck on, we're a film technology company, we're not a digital technology company.
Mhm.
And even though they were instrumental in developing the digital technology, they didn't switch to it. So how much of those failures are because they couldn't evolve and they couldn't evolve their identities, and how much of it was because the companies were outdated and it was time to make
Mhm.
room for the new? So there's that expression, change happens one retirement at a time. Or if you're a
Right.
little bit less politically correct, it's change happens one funeral at a time. So
Right.
I wonder if we can talk about the process of doing this. So I wonder if we
Mm.
can talk about sort of a few things. How do we know when it's time to let something die? How do we prepare? And when do we prepare for death? And I would suggest it needs to be from the very beginning, from the planning stage. How do we celebrate and learn? And how do we support people so they can then transition and renew and transform and move into what's next? So should we
I think the
start
last
with
part is
how do we
really,
know?
really awesome. I kind of want to
Should we
start at the
jump?
bottom and work up,
Should
but
we
it's
jump
no,
to
no, no.
that?
It's all good. Let's go one by one.
It's like
I
he
think
wants
those
to
are good
start with
points.
dessert first and then
I,
go to go to dinner.
I'm all
I
in for
totally
that.
get it. I'm all for that too.
Yeah,
Um,
that's you.
So maybe
You
we can
covered
fly through. Maybe we can just really quickly fly through. When do we know it's time to let something die?
it. Mm,
it's
that's
really interesting for me because you know, where I mean, because I've done this recently, not recently, but 3 years ago at a bank, right? When we shut down a whole group.
mhm,
And we sort of like, it felt like we shut it down because it wasn't flourishing or growing, right? It was almost stale in a way, right? So, and it became more of a identity to someone, not say identity, but it's like this pet project, this great project,
mhm,
right? This great thing that they wanted to do. And but yet, you know, we couldn't fill the seats. We couldn't we couldn't get clients lined up. Like
Mm,
we
mhm,
tried in so many different ways. And although, you know, everyone wanted to keep on trying because it benefited hugely, we just didn't have enough people in the backlog to continue, right?
mhm,
So like there's the aspect of like you're stale, right?
mhm,
It's not there's no growth that's actually happening there, and that I don't like, for me personally, it's against one of my values to like just sit and not do. Like I can't just keep to just the normal thing. I mean, there has
mhm,
to be value to someone. There has to be an outcome to someone. Like it just has to have that
mhm.
thing. But if it's not there, it's like, okay, you know, I don't know why we want to continue on because we don't have anybody in the pipeline.
Todd, would
So
you
let's
add
shut it down.
something? Would you add something to that, or do you want to talk about how do we prepare people for
Mm,
death?
No, I would add something to that because I think that there's some interesting nuance in what you're describing, Joanne. Because I've also I've been in both positions. I've been in the position where something that I've created has died and I wish that it hadn't. And I've been in the position where I've wanted to kill something that someone else created because it didn't seem to be doing, what it was supposed to be doing. And I think and it's so interesting because I'm running up against a bunch of my own biases, and I know that was a different conversation as I say this, but you know, part of me is wondering, well, how do we make the determination that the product or organization or whatever no longer serves and adds value, or that it's a victim of poor PR and marketing,
Mm.
Oh, yeah. Oh, I
right?
know. Yeah, I
Yeah,
and we knew exactly that. And we knew that we couldn't get anywhere
right.
because we didn't have the support that was required to do that, right? So like
And
I know. Yeah, yeah.
And
It's
in
and the thing
just
is
in the
maybe it shouldn't matter.
in the entrepreneurial space is because you're not getting that match between what customers want, clients want, and what
Mhm.
you're offering. You're not making that connection, right? So it happens in the entrepreneurial world as well. It's not just a corporate situation.
although I would argue that in the entrepreneurial world, it's probably easier. And the
Well, you
reason why I
expect it.
think
There's a
that is,
lot more
well,
expectation of death.
yes, and there isn't a layer of other people with their egos in between the idea
Yeah.
and the market, right? Like the idea and the market can exist like this or like this. But if it's like this, then as an entrepreneur, I have specific actions that I can take.
Yeah.
But if there's a barrier between my idea and the market, then
Yeah.
then I have to either get through that barrier, and if the barrier is impermeable, then the idea will die. And maybe that's the answer. Like
Well,
either
that goes
I've
back
given
to
up and
there's
I
no.
don't want to do this part anymore, or I've got an
Yeah.
impermeable barrier and it's
So it's
wasting my
either
time.
that there's no growth in the business or there's no growth in the leaders.
Possibly.
So how do we?
yeah.
How do we? I want to get to dessert.
Good, because it's my favorite part.
How do we prepare people for a business-related death? How do we celebrate it? How do we learn from it? Sort of how do we manage that process? And we'll talk about the skill building after this. What's the actual process of preparing people, celebrating and learning?
I think, do you mind if I just pop right in first? Because for me, it's the example that I want to give is, and Joanne, you taught me how this works, is when you take a software development organization from a traditional waterfall development model to a more agile model, whatever that happens to be. And in order for that to be successful, obviously people need to do different things. They need to think differently. But in my experience, the first thing that you need is an acknowledgement that what was done in the past was successful. An acknowledgement
Or
that
valuable. It may not have been successful, but at least it was valuable.
Exactly. Like all of this good stuff, all of this good work that you're doing or we're doing was extraordinarily important and helped get us to where we are today. If not for that good work, we wouldn't be in this position where we could even make this choice. And when people feel that their work is honored and valued, then, right, because it's honorable and valuable, then that death is easier to handle. That's what I had to say.
Anything you would add, Joanne, to how do we prepare people? How do we celebrate? How do we learn?
Well, it's really interesting because the word prepare is interesting for me because sometimes there is no time to prepare. And I know that, this has happened to me as a manager in the past too. And it's just like, getting a whole team together and just, sharing the news, right? That this is going to happen. And then having the conversation with them as to what does this mean? What do we do next? And all that kind of stuff. Like I would prefer like having that kind of like, that aspect of understanding how to die well, like with the team. Like if I had that beforehand, right, then I think it would make it easier to have that discussion, right? But because these products and services last for so long, it's kind of really, really hard to kind of always be having those discussions. But I think we always have to remind ourselves of that and have that. But I think we can't. I guess my point is that we don't always have time to prepare. But when it does happen, sometimes we just have to have that, that family meeting with everybody to kind of have that, discussion as to now what do we need to do, right?
The family meeting. Yeah.
If you can't prepare, and it's great, like it's having a great conversation and doing exactly what you said, Todd. But it's just when you can't prepare, that's where I think it can be a bit of a challenge.
Yeah, and it requires some bravery because those are difficult conversations, right? People are wrapped up in their organizations, their products, their companies. It's
and what natural. We talked about earlier on, it's their identity is really tied up in that.
Exactly.
I'm lucky that I've always worked in the entrepreneurial environment. So death and
Yeah.
renewal and transformation is always part of that. And, you
Mhm.
know, now it's cool to talk about failure, but the reality is everybody always knew you're going to have to pivot, renew, whatever words were used, whatever was cool at that
Yeah.
time. But I'm curious if we can switch to the skill set, because
Hmm.
how do we support individuals? How do we develop the skills of grieving? And as leaders, how do we lead that? Because, Joanne, while you were talking, what I was thinking about is a lot of leaders get kind of shell shocked in larger organizations when they have to announce the closing of a business. And I think
Mhm.
because our society has such a hard time talking about death, dying, or anything along those lines, there's a real sense of taboo, and therefore just try and get this over with as quickly as possible. And then there's all sorts of legal issues that come in when you close a company or close part of a company. Like it is very complicated, very complex, very
Mhm.
messy. But
Yes.
so if we take out the legal part and some of the other issues that are more business specific, and we focus on the human part, where I think a lot of leaders could develop a much stronger skill set, a much better skill set, is in recognizing that their job as leaders, ideally, is to take people through the grieving process. And part of
Mhm.
that is, I mean, whether this is always possible or not is a whole different thing, but really being honest and saying, we're shutting down this business for these reasons. Here's how we're going to support you emotionally as well as financially, or whatever the calls are. And a lot of companies kind of go through the motions of it, but they don't really do that, again, because a lot of leaders and a lot of people in the organization really shy away from that. So it really is, I think the skill set starts with, how do we start developing our own comfort with death and loss and grieving as leaders? How do we become more curious about how we can approach that and make the grieving process actually a renewal process? And
Mhm.
it doesn't mean we can skip the piece of really messy, ugly crying and all the stuff that needs to go with that. But if we can grieve well, and we're supported to grieve well, not just to die well, but to grieve well,
Mhm.
we can actually learn and be stronger after that process, assuming that we're allowed to go through that in the proper process. Yeah,
Mhm.
and we all know about the Kubler-Ross 5 stages of grief. There's a 7 stages of grief, and the bottom line is there is no stages. It's just a messy ball of wax,
Yeah.
and we're constantly cycling through, right? So,
Yeah.
but there are, each, ideally what we do is each time we go through some variation of these stages,
Mhm.
ideally what we're doing is going less intense. It's ideally a shorter time frame. I mean, obviously this takes time depending on how connected
Mhm.
we were. But the bottom line is, being curious about what can we learn when it's the appropriate time. So I would suggest maybe we need to add curiosity to the stages of grief.
Mm.
Yeah, I think there's two things that kind of came out with me when you start talking. Like, well, the leader is actually going through grief themselves, so they
Yes.
also need the support, because it's really challenging for them to be,
Yeah.
doing this with whatever size department.
Mhm.
And a
The
lot of
second
times
thing,
they're thrown to the wolves.
yeah. So yeah, and they,
Mhm.
but this is what came to me was the aspect of, just like death doulas, right? Like,
Mhm.
we know that a person is terminally ill or will be dying or whatever the case may be. And it's just, you get brought in, right, during the later stages of life, right, for them. And in a time where you can still prepare them and help them with their passage, right?
Mhm.
But in large organizations, I would sit there and say that they probably know that that particular department or service or product is going to die a lot
Mhm.
earlier than we actually think. It's not like all of a sudden they go, okay, tomorrow it's going to happen.
Yeah.
I really think that, back to what you're saying, Todd, is that it's somewhat seen as a failure. And I think our
Mhm.
CIOs and the CEOs and the people who are leading the specific areas, if they looked at it as like a death doula would be looking at it, is
Mhm.
like bringing everybody on board earlier, like with the leaders, with whoever
Mhm.
else, so we can start prepare. What do we need to have in order to actually get this
Mhm.
going? I need to support the leaders. And so it's almost like you need to have, like, the will already created. We
Mhm.
got to make sure the dog's taken care of, right? Like, like there's all those things, and the Starbucks coffee, right?
Mhm.
So, you have to kind of like
Yeah.
prepare that, but we don't, because I think we think it's a failure, or we can't say it because, legal perspective, or because of, whatever they're doing afterwards. But I think there's this
And there's
aspect
so
of,
little
we know.
recognition that we can extract value from that process too. If we handle
Yeah.
all that process right, we can actually extract a lot of value.
Oh, yes.
Well,
Oh, yes.
n-
The people would love
not
it.
only, yeah, and not only that, because like what's coming up for me as you're saying this stuff is that there's a bottom line implication too.
Mm.
Like how much time, energy, resources are spent keeping a zombie organization alive or a zombie
Oh, yeah.
product alive, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Like many things have lived well past the point of usefulness or providing value.
Yeah.
And I'm sure that we could all just think of half a dozen right now off the top of our head if we wanted to.
I'm thinking back to the car. It's not providing
Yeah.
the value holistically
Exactly.
that it needs to, right? Like
Mm.
Right.
it's past, it's
Yeah.
time, right?
Yeah.
So the gas ones.
It's so interesting that like often I think when we talk about curiosity and the curious leader, it's very easy for a leader to look at it and say, okay, that's great. If I had the time to do that, with all the other stuff that I'm working on, then it would be fine. But in this particular situation, there's a really clear return on investment that goes along with being good at grieving, with understanding how that's meant to go, because in order for us to innovate, we need to have the room to innovate, and that room is the stuff that, like, the energy, the resources, the time that we continue to spend on things that really ought to just not exist anymore.
Yeah.
It's
So
so the innovation. Sorry, the innovation aspect of what you're just saying. I'm getting going. This is someone. So I know the time, but the innovation related. Like if you knew as an organization as you grew, right, that we had these ideas that these things are going to get shut
yeah.
down, and it's all well known beforehand, and we're all going to talk about it when it happens, guys. So just be prepared. But once we get to that stage, we need to innovate. So what we're going to be doing is we'll be shifting people over to innovation or whatever the case may be.
Yeah.
Right? It just there's such a beauty in knowing that this is the life of how
Yes.
it's all going to work, and coming into a company knowing that, and if you had a company that's like, it's exciting, it's great. I think our entrepreneurs do it much better,
Mm.
right? And can do it much
They
better because
do.
they're so
They do.
close to it, they
Even
see it.
even
Yeah.
in the entrepreneurial world, I think it can be done better.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Yeah.
With all the
Yeah.
research that I've done into trauma, healing, grieving, all that stuff, it's I think we can do it significantly better than we have been. And we can do it in our education world as well, where
Mhm.
we can, if we build in failure and recovery into our education programs and our entrepreneurial programs, we can actually extract value much more effectively, accelerate learning better, and put people in a position where they're able to take risks much better. Yeah.
Mhm.
So we're at the end, unfortunately. Any last thoughts, any wrap up, any highlights that you'd like to leave people with?
There's actually one thing that I want to leave, and it's not what we talked about, but it's come up for me just right now. And it's interesting because Joanne, you might appreciate this. Like the thing that's popping into my head is the Agile Manifesto,
Mm.
and specifically people over process. And if we're good at grieving and we plan for the death of products, organizations, companies that no longer serve,
Mm.
that absolutely removes the person from the process, right? The process of dying doesn't have to do with the individual anymore. It has to do with the space and time that organization or product or whatever existed. And that
the
I think
cycle
is
of growth.
really exactly. And I
The
think
cycle of
that's
growth.
super awesome.
Yeah.
This was a fun conversation. Thank you.
Joanne, last thoughts for you very quickly?
I think that the one thing is I don't want people to to look at death as a failure at all. Like
Yeah.
any of this stuff is it's all part of the natural process, right? Even
Yeah.
if we can plan for it or not, it happens in humans that way. Like it's just the same thing, right? So it's very natural. But I think if we start to recognize and talk about it more, and build it in, that's when we'll have much better conversations, much better connections, much better in so many different ways. So
Mhm.
thank you.
Here's to growth.
Awesome.
Here's to renewal. Here's to transformation.
Indeed.
Thanks
Yeah.
for a really
here's-
fun conversation. Go ahead. Sorry.
And
Tom.
here's to the folks who joined us too. Thank you
Absolutely,
very much.
yeah.
Always.
Thanks for the comments. Thanks for the participation.
Indeed.
It was
Yeah.
really fun. Thank you so much.
It was.
All right.
All right. Well, see you next time.
2 weeks.
Right.